This is the program on constitutional government, and our guest today is Irwin Stelzer, an economist with a political interest. He's wincing.
No, our racket was called political economy.
Yeah, political economy, but he studies economics, I would say, from a political point of view, rather than politics from an economic point of view, like so many rather foolish political scientists. And he is a columnist for the Sunday Times and the Courier Mail in Australia, and he's a contributing editor at the Weekly Standard, where he has 2 articles in the latest issue, one very interesting on the oil question. He's been at the American Enterprise Institute and a senior director and fellow at the Hudson Institute in Washington. He's a consultant on market strategy, pricing, and antitrust issues, and regulation in the United States and the United Kingdom. He got his PhD in economics from Cornell and has held teaching appointments at various universities. And he's going to talk to us today about Trump, President Trump.
Yes, so anyone who wants a bolt for the door, now is the time. Look, I approach this with a considerable amount of trepidation. First of all, I do not have the learning in political philosophy and all of that stuff. I'm just a tradesman who learned something about the economy. Second, any discussion of President Trump is likely to produce degrees of incivility, I think not seen since the Boston Patriots. I don't mean your team, I mean the ones who tarred and feathered people who they disagreed with. And third, I have to confess at the beginning that my New York City ear finds the Trump accent and shticks agreeable. So you can discount a lot of what I say because of that. And finally, I can't make up my mind about a lot of these issues. So as I understand it, this is a seminar throwing out ideas. We'll see where we end up. But my most terrifying trepidation is that our host, Professor Mansfield, who does these multiple conversations with Bill Kristol, said we should be careful of trying to define Trump by his ideas. He's a demagogue, unpredictable, aiming to cause surprise, et cetera, to which I would add he's a liar, sometimes willfully so, sometimes because, as I think it was Lorenz Hart's lyrics, put it as the self-deception that believes the lie. And I think that's true. But I'm going to throw caution to the winds, rather. And but don't confuse my description of this phenomenon with endorsement. If you want endorsement, you can ask me later, and I'll just tell you what I think. Trump never sat down with a reading list and decided to cull the great philosophers and political scientists for ideas that would interfere with his evenings watching Fox News. So instead, but don't discount the influence of Steve Bannon, of whom you've heard, who does have a full-blown, coherent worldview and philosophy that he grafted onto Donald Trump's instincts, prejudices, hunches as to what appeals to voters. So I want to preface the following with this thought. When Trump says he will put America first, he has not studied the pre-World War II history of America, and did not know that the America First Committee, which was founded at Yale Law School by, among others, Jerry Ford and Potter Stewart, and with the appalling Charles Lindbergh as a spokesman. When he labeled the media enemies of the people, that was not based on his study of the French Revolution or his reading of Ibsen or his reading of Nikita Khrushchev, who said that phrase should never be used because it eliminates the possibility of any kind of ideological fight and calls for the physical annihilation of anyone who agrees with you. But Bannon is there. I mean, he knows what those phrases mean. He knows what the history means, and Trump finds them agreeable and consistent. So I think Bannon spent a lifetime seeking an effective vessel to whom to transfer his ideas, this coherent philosophy, and I've chosen to call Trumpism, which I know may not please you, but I'll take a chance, okay? Now, the first step in this is to put America first. And to put America first, you have to end voters' dependence on traditional media. To do that, because the traditional media tend to niggle around the edges, but basically they are part of the establishment, part of the status quo. And so that's where Bannon came up with this idea of enemies of the people. Now, every sort of dictator, authoritarian, needs an enemy list. In Latin America, it's American capitalists. In Europe, for a long time, it was Jews, or if you wanted to be polite about it, you called it Israel. To Trump, the campaigner, it was Wall Street, the place to which he eventually went to hire most of his people. So I think they selected the media as the enemy of the people for three reasons. First, anyone who watched campaigns would know the rapturous response that Sarah Palin got and subsequent very conservative politicians get when they attack the media, the mainstream media. You remember Trump's attacks on Megyn Kelly, on Charles Krauthammer. They resonated with his base. Second, it's important to delegitimize sources of information other than yourself, so that what you have is, you remember the old Chico Marx, who do you believe, what I tell you or your own eyes. If you delegitimize other sources, then tweets become a great source of information, and you've gone around and over the traditional media. And third, it sets the stage for curtailing the privileges accorded to traditional media. So you now have talk show hosts calling in on Skype to ask questions of the press secretary. And you have traditional media worry that they're not going to get their usual seats at presidential press conferences and so on, or get called upon. All of that is necessary if to neuter the traditional media, so that you can essentially clear the way for what the president calls America First. Now, let me tell you the three policies that are necessary. And what I want you to think about as I talk is which of the policies you find objectionable. I know I learned last night some of the intense antipathy, let's call it, I would call it style if it was any, to the Trump vulgarity, shall we say. It certainly does not appeal to a more effete, elitist audience. I think that's putting it at a minimum. But I'm trying to talk about policy, and you might keep a note in your head as to which of these appeal to you and which don't. First, there are three parts of America First: infrastructure, protectionism, and foreign policy. The infrastructure part, the underlying basis for these are two. First is emotional. This is rather simple. You got a builder as president. He has an emotional reaction. He would like our airports to be better than those in Asia, our trains faster than those in Japan and France, our roads smoother than those in Germany. This isn't a matter of cost-benefits analysis. This is a matter of national pride. This is how you want your country to look. Now, it is true that over the years, dictators also try to build glitzy infrastructure projects, sports stadiums and stuff. And I'm sure that immediately leaps to mind as I said this to many people. But the first part of this infrastructure thing has got nothing to do with money or cost benefits analysis. It has to do with pride. The second part is that if you want to make America great again, you need pretty rapid economic growth, 3%, 4%, sometimes 5%, he says, sometimes 6%. It depends on the target, on the mood of the moment. But certainly 1% won't do it and 2% won't do it. 3%, it's okay, 4% better, 5 or 6% would be wonderful, and if he can figure out how to do that, I hope he will tell us. The more rapid economic growth would solve many of the problems, no question about that. It would generate tax revenues, you wouldn't have to make as many hard choices as we now have to make, and there would be plenty of cash to fund the Democrats' wildest dreams and Republicans' military buildups or whatever they have in mind. So far, that's pretty traditionally conservative. Get more economic growth, you get more cash, and so on. But I think unlike the economic conservatives, let's call them the traditional wing of the Republican Party, Trump isn't concerned, I believe, is not concerned about deficits. Now, he says he is, and the promises he made about deficits, but the fact is he would take infrastructure and rising deficits over no infrastructure and a more closely balanced budget any day of the week. And he's not talking about a piddly little $800 billion infrastructure program that satisfied President Obama. He's talking about $1 trillion. Now, where did he get the $1 trillion from? It's bigger than 800 billion. I mean, anybody could understand that. But still, the fact is that if rising deficits, and here's where I think we have to think about it, because Bannon is very smart. And if rising deficits were to trigger inflation, remember, we have a pretty fully employed economy at the moment, given constraints of labor supply. And therefore, an infrastructure program might end up being quite inflationary because there isn't any excess capacity in the economy, or not enough to accommodate a $1 trillion infrastructure program. So if you think about it, now I'm trying to remember when I was radical, which was, Lincoln was not president at the time. But if you think about what inflation is designed to do, and what Bannon really knows, is it would wipe out the rentier class. I mean, that's what it's designed to do, and the crucifixion of debtors on the cross of a relatively stable economy. Trump is a traditional debtor. We don't know how much relative to his assets, but he is going, like all real estate developers, Andy can testify to this, they go and hock big time. And inflation is a wonderful thing if you have a lot of debts. It wipes them out for you. And I think you have a confluence of Bannon's understanding of that. And remember, during the campaign, Trump tried out the idea of reducing the national debt by declaring bankruptcy. In other words, he finds the debt overhang rather burdensome, wouldn't like to pay it back if he didn't have to. So I think there is kind of a radical position. But if you go back to what conservatives say, which is, no, the way out of this is faster growth, that's based on the notion, as President Kennedy said, that a rising tide lifts all boats. But we now know that's not true. It wasn't true before the Great Recession, and it has not been true since. The rising tide of economic growth has lifted a lot of yachts, but it's lifted a lot of rowboats moored at, well, I don't know what you do with rowboats. I've never been in one, but whatever. They didn't have a lot of those on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. The result has been a revolt of the blue-collar masses. They've not shared in the boom. They didn't share in the boom before the Great Recession. They were hurt badly by the Great Recession, and they are now part of what Trump likes to call his movement. I think this is a serious problem, this problem of inequality in America. If any of you want to read Piketty's book, I know a lot of people who own it, so I'm sure you can get their uncut copy from them. The battle over the corporate tax code which is now looming, is interesting because it originally started as a tax reform, which would have included a battle over the personal tax code, which might have addressed the inequality question, but that is now being put off, or the major part of it is being put off. And I think the anomaly that I can't quite figure out is that the Trump-Ryan healthcare reforms benefited young, affluent people at the expense of older, poor people. In other words, the higher taxes went away in Obamacare, more reliance on Medicaid, which was then not going to be adequately funded. And that's the Trump base. So if anybody can figure out the politics of it, let me know. I can't, but they were quite willing to do that. And I think it's partly because when Trump gets in a negotiation, if you feel that your main talent is negotiation, as long as it concludes with a deal, it almost doesn't matter what the deal is. That's how he bought the Plaza Hotel, which then went bankrupt. But he concluded the negotiation very quickly. He called in the owners. He said, "What do you want? I'll give it to you, and I won't even do due diligence." Well, that's a little hard offer to turn down. And he got the Plaza Hotel. But yeah, he went broke doing it. The second part of, let's call it America First, is protection. Now, Trump distinguishes between protection and protectionism when he thinks about it. And that's because trade policy is the tip of a much larger iceberg for the Bannon-Trump people. I'll talk about the details of trade in just a minute, but think about it this way. All of the agreements, which, the multilateral agreements, which were the fashion until now, the big deal we were going to sign with the EU, or TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, which really wasn't a trade deal, it was a geopolitical effort to insert ourselves into the future of Asia. All of these multilateral deals involve ceding American sovereignty to multinational institutions for arbitration. The courts would not be the domestic courts, they would be international arbitration courts, so that, or just as, for example, in environmental policy, the Paris Accord cedes domestic control over environmental policy to, in this case, a toothless, but nevertheless international agency, the UN, just as, we've systematically ceded other aspects of our policy to other international institutions, and such as some Supreme Court justices want to incorporate international law or laws or decisions by foreign courts into American decision-making. I think Steve Breyer is the leading proponent of recognizing what foreign courts do. This is why Trump now says, I'll negotiate with anybody, but I'm not going to negotiate multilateral agreements, and we're not going to cede jurisdiction over disputes to anybody except American courts, on the theory that American courts will give us a fair shake, and those foreigners really will not decide anything in America's favor. Now that, what he calls protection, is protection of American workers. It's supposed to be as bad a word as protectionism, which is what is opposed by traditional Republicans. A traditional Republican Party is free trade. The Democratic Party is not. The trade unions are not. And that has been the traditional division in American policy for many years. Now, here's the problem. I guess Trump is going to be meeting with Xi this weekend, I think, at Mar-a-Lago, which he in which he feels more comfortable than at the White House, which I could understand it if you have that kind of psyche. They're going to talk about trade, and we economists, most economists, are worried that we will be lurching toward protectionism. I think it was this morning that the Secretary of Commerce said we're not going to start a trade war. There already is a trade war. We just happen to be losing it. And it's been going on for years. And that's reasonable. If you think about China, for example, they make no bones about it. They steal American intellectual property. You talk to anybody in the entertainment industry or anything else, they steal American intellectual property. You can only do business in China if you turn over your intellectual property to them, which is what problem Apple is having. They spend they've just had the meeting for the democratic reassertion of the authority of the leader, in which they have agreed to spend billions on industries of the future, renewables, chips. That's subsidizing these people who will then become world leaders because they'll have scale. And if you send a $50,000 Jeep Wrangler to China and you want to sell it, there's a $40,000 tariff. Now, when somebody says, well, we're going to start a trade war if we start reacting with China, I don't know what they're talking about, and neither does Trump. Or you take NAFTA, which they've agreed now to change in rather more modest ways, not deal with currency manipulation. One of the problems with NAFTA is it was supposed to encourage the Mexican economy to grow by creating a market here for Mexican goods. The trouble is a lot of people are shipping stuff made in Asia to Mexico, who's then transshipping it to the United States as if it were made in Mexico. And so we want to stop that. So the problem is, again, I have two problems with a lot of my colleagues on free trade. One is there's no such thing. So the only question now is how do you improve a system that's biased against us? And the other is that conservative economists who have favored free trade over the years and still do are quite right. It would lead to greater efficiency and probably increase economic growth. But it has distributional consequences that people are unwilling to consider. Free trade does collateral damage. I tried this one out last night. It didn't work well, so I depend on my hostess to stay quiet while I repeat it, and then she can point out the errors later. The little old lady in North Carolina who is stitching T-shirts or sneakers is the collateral damage. She didn't do anything. She's just hanging around stitching T-shirts, and suddenly she hasn't got a job. The question is, what do we do about the distributional consequences? The recent academic studies show that trade with China has had a devastating effect on employment of unskilled workers and on the wages of unskilled workers. But we do know that it also increases the incomes at the very top of the thing. If you're running I think I used the example of a beer company, a domestic beer company like Budweiser, and suddenly you acquire beer companies all over the world, you now have a broader base on which to draw a bigger salary or greater responsibility and so on. So I think what Trump has in mind when he says we're going to get coal miners' jobs back. Well, he's not going to get coal miners' jobs back. The market's taking care of that. But that some, what was it in Willie Loman's wife said, attention must be paid. I think attention must be paid to this problem if there is to be any residual support for free trade. So distributional problems. Again, I think that we have to redefine the national interest. The national interest has to be not only in aggregate economic growth, not only in raising all boats, but in the kind of hunt for equity that has always made me very nervous because, well, you know that long, I won't bother you with that long quote from Table Talk, by Selden about equity is as large as the chancellor's foot or something like that.
All these wonderful illusions.
Well, I'm an overeducated economist.
No, you're right.
So all of which after I finished my degree, I can explain that later, but that's different. It's always made us nervous, but I think now you are not going to get any support for efficient economic policies if you don't address the equity aspects of efficiency, and that unfortunately gets into areas of economics that are very, very difficult, and we're not going to discuss here. Let me finish with talking a few minutes on immigration and foreign policy. There's no question that control of our borders, you're not a country if you can't control your borders, he says, and that's certainly true of any country. As the British found out when, to the surprise of the establishment, they voted to get out of the EU, largely because of wanting to control immigration, which is sort of strange because the immigration they want to control is only from part of the EU. That wasn't their biggest problem, but nevertheless they want to control immigration, and so does Trump. And so we're going to have a wall. Now, I'm loving the wall, not because it will be built, but because what they're finding out when they try to build it, that most of it has to be on private land, which involves constitutional taking of property. It makes Judge Souter now the new hero of conservatives who want to build this wall. The lawyers will get rich trying these taking cases. It's going to be a nightmare, and I think that's a pretty good thing because it does something that was done to Trump on immigration policy, and I don't agree with this court decision, but it reminded him after the heady days of writing executive orders. I think there's 2 more coming out today, that there's something called the courts, and they can stop you. And then he found out in healthcare there's something called the Congress, and it can stop you. So that I'm rather more optimistic than I was before these barriers, before the Founding Fathers system reasserted itself. But when Trump says to Angela Merkel, now he didn't have to crudely present her with a bill. Here's a bill for what you owe on NATO, including interest since NATO was founded. I mean, but if you're used to dealing with contractors, I guess that's what they do to you if you don't pay. So nevertheless, Germany spends 1.2% of its GDP on defense. It promised to spend 2% and hasn't. We spend 3.6%. Brussels, the great believer in a unified EU, spends 0.9%. And I would like to dig into just what that is for. So we're now, he's now insulted in 1 week Australia, Germany, Japan. I'm trying to remember. But the question is not the form of it. You don't hand Angela Merkel a bill. She's the leader of Europe. She is the most consequential politician maybe in the world other than Putin. But the substance of it, is anybody here against having people honor their 2% commitment to NATO spending? So now I have great doubts about everything I told you, just so you know. I just want to get that out. Let me suggest that in addition to paying more attention to distributional problems, we're going to have to pay more attention to this question of sovereignty and international institutions, our relation to international institutions, because, and not because, and he's right, it's to maintain support for people for our system from people who feel increasingly remote from it. I mean, if you're remote from your federal government, imagine how remote you are from the UN. Now, I would add that it would make a wonderful condominium. And I could picture the next Trump Tower, but no, that's aside. So if you agree with that, we're left with this balance. And this is, I don't know how to make it. Again, I gave it a run last night. Let's assume that we're in 2020, all right? Trump has succeeded in the following things. He's gotten tax cuts for American business and some for Americans. He has gotten a repeal of a whole bunch of regulations that can't be justified as adding to efficiency. He's rebuilt the military, which his budget doesn't do, but nevertheless, assume he did that, and he's restored power to the states with block grants instead of very specific spending. On the other hand, he's degraded the office of the president with tweets and vulgar behavior. He's lowered the quality of national discourse by, among other things, lying. He's alienated many of our allies. And he has created a very dangerous world with, we worry about his reaction to provocation. He doesn't seem to take that very well. So how do you balance these things? That's what I'm trying to figure out. How do you balance these things? I have friends who say that my list of all those things, that's fine, but we're never going to get him because he's going to blow us all up. Well, that's pretty final. So I guess if you think that, fine. But I'm trying to get away from what I consider the surface problems and try to balance the costs and benefits of Donald Trump. And that's what I'm hoping you'll enable me to do before I leave here. Thank you.
All right. Questions? Matthias.
How does the potential collaboration of Russia with the Trump campaign weigh in on your balance? Because I don't know if we're all aware, but Flynn last night said
he wants
to collaborate.
Well,
It's going to get pretty hot pretty quick.
Well, first of all, I have two reactions to that. One is Flynn was let's call it an unfortunate selection, but that basically the foreign policy team that Trump has put together is a pretty good team. I mean, they know about national security. The generals know what they're doing. Tillerson is apparently a competent guy. I mean, he ran something about as big as the U.S. government, as far as I could tell, although he was somewhat impatient with checks and balances, as I understand it. So I'd like to get that out of the way. The second thing is, I have to tell you, I don't care. I mean, I like to worry about stuff I can worry about. What am I going to worry about? That Trump played footsie with the Russians during the campaign? I would worry if there were evidence that it affected the result. I don't like it. I don't like the idea that the chairman of an investigating committee trundles over to the White House to talk to the people he's investigating. But we have other things. We have a Senate investigating committee. We have the FBI on this. So I can't get as exercised as about this as I can about other policies. And he's there, guys. He's there. The decisions I've asked you to think about are decisions we have to make. He ain't going to be dragged out of the office in chains because of any obscure documents they find about footsie with the Russians.
I'm surprised you think that, actually. I think you have more faith in the strength of American democracy than you do. This really strikes at the core of what sovereignty and legitimacy are.
Well, what is it, the it?
Well, the sovereign ruler of this nation is not Trump, it's the American people.
Right, I agree with that.
And they have mechanisms of getting him out of office.
Right, and if they find these things that you think they found, I would expect them to trigger those mechanisms.
Right, so anyway, so you don't think they're going to get...
And probably if they found that, I would be for impeachment.
Okay, good.
But the likelihood that that's going to solve any problems we have with Donald Trump is really quite remote. I mean, and the people who are really for vigorous impeachment, who were not the last time it was used, I guess consistency is a hobgoblin of some sort or something. But look, we got rid of Nixon when he was found to have committed what we would call crimes, right? Gaucherie doesn't count, so we didn't get rid of Clinton. And if it's gaucherie, we're not going to get rid of Trump. If there are crimes, high crimes and misdemeanors of some sort, he'll go, and then we'll get Mike Pence. And, well, you know, Mike Pence was sent from central casting to be the visible offset of Donald Trump. I mean, you look, you know, you look at him and he reminds you of your bank manager or some safe person like that who couldn't think an errant thought if he tried, until you think about his social policy, which you really won't very much like. You'll prefer, let's call it the free-loving Donald Trump to Mike Pence any day. Sir. Oh, I'm sorry. You're going to call on people? Yeah.
Why don't you do it?
No, you do it. You
All right.
I can.
Ross, yeah. Ross Terrell.
You were very condescending to the question, and I just give one example where I think it's simply ill-based. The Chinese wanted to meet George W. Bush in Texas. The
Right.
agreement to meet Mr. Obama in California was jointly discussed and approved by both sides. I don't know what's the basis for you saying Trump wouldn't be comfortable with Xi in the White House. You said he'd be more comfortable in Florida. Having been involved in some of these things, I think the Chinese like these
Yes.
special.
But it's perfectly obvious that Trump is more comfortable in surroundings he has created.
Well, Nixon loved to go.
I'm not against it. They can keep Camp David for all I care and hold it for the next
I
president.
thought it was a condescending.
No, it's not condescending. It struck me that he had a choice, right? He could make it a state visit and do the whole thing, and he didn't want to, and he did it there. I don't care where they meet. What I care is what they say. And my hope is that Trump is going to be pretty tough on trade and intellectual property theft and all of the things that the Chinese do. I don't think he's... my regret is that the lever he had was TPP. TPP gave us the opportunity to set the rules for a large part of the trade in the Asian area, Asian Pacific area, and we blew it. Hillary blew it, Hillary Clinton blew it, Trump blew it. It was a geopolitical, not a trade deal, and my hope is that would have gone through. It didn't. What Trump's going to do with Xi, I don't know, and I don't really care where he does it. So I did. I am condescending Trump in some particulars, but that's not one of them. I'll give you the list later.
When you went through the list, these positive and negatives, one thing you didn't mention anything was this distributional issue which you have referred to. And the other, in the negatives, I think you had made reference to the inflation, and which I think is going to be a very serious problem, particularly if you're going to be cutting off immigration. You have 4+ unemployment rate, and there just isn't much room there, I think, in terms. So I think will be inflation, but actually, my main question is on something different, and that is, it seems to me when you look at the last 30 or 40 years and what's happened in the economy, is that there has been a switch, or a massive transfer of wealth from this blue-collar group that we've talked about to members of the financial industry,
Right.
I would say. And it seems to me, of course, Trump, I don't think really ever addressed that, but you look at the private equity industry, you look at the activist shareholder. Most of what they end up doing is lowering, either firing workers, getting workers fired at their target companies that they come in, getting their pensions thrown out, send the companies into bankruptcy, and all. So this is what the effect is on the workers, they lose their jobs, they have less than they had before. The beneficiaries of it, of this financial industry, and I don't know what the statistics are, but I'm sure that as a part of the overall economy, the financial industry has increased substantially. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are, in terms of this phenomenon, and it seems to me that whether there are any thoughts you have in terms of addressing it.
Well, yeah, a lot. Let's try to sort. You just threw in all of the economic issues we face. So I'll try to address them in order. First of all, the effect of cutting off immigration, creating inflation. I'm not so sure that's true. We do know that immigration does have a depressing effect on wage rates, especially among the unskilled, right? And I think a professor here has estimated that at around 6% is the depressing effect on wages. I'm not sure that there's something called labor cost push inflation. I don't know. And remember, we have the Fed sitting out there. I mean, they are a player in the inflation game. So I worry a little about inflation, and I would worry a lot about it if there weren't political forces that will try to constrain the deficit some more, because running deficits in a fully employed economy is a very dangerous business. And the notion that you can contain it once it starts, you can't. I mean, once it starts, and it's very, very hard to get under control. The distributional question, there's no question that finance capital is now a bigger part of the economy. I'm not sure that it has the malign effects that you described. For example, a lot of the private equity deals that result in firings are companies that would have collapsed absent the firings. I mean, these are not great, healthy institutions that are expanding. A lot of these that get leveraged and then sweated down were companies that would not be able to provide jobs absent this kind of sweating. And a lot of those companies then go on to be quite successful. So I'm not sure that what we have is rapacious finance capitalism attacking the manufacturing sector and laying off people. I just don't see that as right. We do have a policy quirk in the tax code, which is the treatment of the income of these people as capital gains instead of income. This is the carried interest problem, which Trump has said he would like to eliminate. Remember, he doesn't like these people anymore. I mean, he had a lot of bankruptcy. He didn't like these people very much. So if carried interest goes out, and then we have a reasonable, fairer distribution of after-tax income, because these guys are now having great trouble maintaining their fee structure because they're not able to deliver the gains they used to deliver. The market and the activists, you mentioned activist investors who are doing something to feebly but increasingly effectively to correct the terrible anomalies in the corporate governance compensation system, which is bizarre, is the only way to describe it, where they sit on each other's compensation committees, or where the consultant that advises on the CEO's business then gets consulting assignments from the CEO, or then advises on the CEO compensation, gets consulting assignments, which ought to be. I don't like regulation, but I once tried to get a sympathetic congressman to say any company like Cooper's or any of those that did compensation consulting could not do other consulting for that same company for 5 years or something. It didn't go very far. So I think all of those things are at play. There's no question. And it seems to me we have to get not at the result of the distribution system, but at the process that produces it. so that if we could get the corporate governance system, which Berlin means in, 1936, I guess, pointed out that once you have this sharp division between ownership and control, you're going to get a lot of rent-seeking by the managerial class. If we can get that under control, and that the markets are sort of getting there on that. Not so long since 1936, so maybe they'll eventually get there. If we get that under control, if we could get under control the disparate effect of trade on distribution of incomes. For example, everybody says, well, you got to remember, you get all that cheap stuff in Walmart. That's to the benefit of lower income people. Well, if you ask the guy, which would you like, cheap sneakers or a paycheck? I think he'd pick the paycheck. But even that won't solve it. We're going to have to develop income transfer systems that accommodate, that are not demeaning, that are not socially disruptive, because working has an advantage. At least I hope so. I mean, I don't know how to stop, so I rather hope it has some advantage. We're a long way from that. We're a long way from even discussing that. I mean, the labor market is a shambles. There's a great paper at the AEI by Nick Eberstadt, in which he talks about the portion of prime working age men who are not any longer in the workforce, of whom half are on opioids. Nick is a very good researcher. I haven't gotten the numbers myself, but I'm sure he's probably right. Until we're going to have, and there's no interest in the political system in even looking at this problem. Now, maybe the Trump victory has shaken up the political classes. I doubt it. So I'm rather pessimistic on that score than I am on the score of corporate reform.
Paul.
I have two questions, and I don't know which one to ask, so I'll ask them both.
Ask him both. What the hell?
On the one side, I think the whole Trump diagnosis of the central problem is totally wrong. The problems of the working class are not trade and immigration. I don't disagree that there are distributional consequences, but I think these are marginal as compared to the fact that we have an uneducated population relative to what is demanded by our economy. We are turning out people who really aren't able to work, they aren't able to perform in the economy at a level that is needed. And so that's the one thing. The second thing is our family structure has been undermined by the welfare state, so that we have people growing up in single-parent families, and they become exceedingly dependent, or they become dependent later in life, and they go into alcohol and drugs, or get involved in the underground economy. So there's all kinds of malaise out there that Trump isn't even beginning to address. And so therefore his project will fail. And the second point is that I think we're already seeing that the institutions that he's attacking are so powerful and so strong that as much as he rails and carries on, it only reveals the strength of the institutions that he's taking on.
Is that bad or good, by the way, as you see?
Yeah, whether it's the courts, or whether it's the media, or whether it's Congress, or the federal system. I mean, I don't see it. He's not going to get $1 trillion infrastructure. It's $1 trillion over 20 years, maybe, but I mean, it's not going to be $1 trillion in 3 years for sure.
No, 10. It's supposed to be 10.
Well, 10's a long time. That's $300 billion a year. And if that's going to really come out in the latter end of it, because it takes so long to get these projects going, and the economy is mainly driven by Federal Reserve policy, not by fiscal policy. We learned that Reagan ran enormous deficits, the largest deficit since Roosevelt, but it had no significant effect on inflation in the economy. we had economic growth, but the inflation rate went way down. So I don't see how all of these consequences that you're spinning out are likely as long as we have a Federal Reserve that's determined to keep the inflation rate down, and they look like they're gonna take
Remember, there's a
actions
lot of-
quite soon. So, but I think my fundamental point is that the Trump impact is going to be relatively modest, either for good or bad.
Well, that's reassuring, in a way. I mean, it's reassuring that almost any president's impact is modest. I mean, we had Jimmy Carter, remember. You certainly wouldn't want him to have had a major impact on the economy. Well, he did actually, got a 17% inflation rate. Let me address each of those points very quickly, okay? I don't know anything about education. The only hope that I could imagine, and this is an economist talking, is that the growth of alternatives and choices might fill the gap. But what we're seeing is because vocational training at some point became déclassé. Smart people went to academics, and the really dumb people learned how to be a plumber. Of course, now the plumber makes more than the really smart people, but that's another matter, and works on his own schedule. I don't know how you fix that. The current unemployed workforce does not have the skills to take the jobs that would be available. I have not spoken to a single employer who doesn't complain about a labor shortage. And the open vacancies are very, very high. So what I try to do is not worry about insoluble problems. Some problems are insoluble. At least not, I can't think of a solution. I can think of solutions to other problems. Doesn't matter, nobody does them, but at least I feel I've solved the problem. I can think of a solution to immigration. We ought to have bidding for visas by employers so that people who come in will go to the most useful, profit-producing work. Okay. Family structure, I don't know. I mean, I've read Charles Murray. I think you've had Charles Murray here.
Without violence.
Pardon me?
Without violence.
Yes, I congratulate you on that. And the picture he paints is grim, and I would suggest insoluble. I don't know. I mean, you can't go into a community like that and say, well, here's one of your compatriots, Miss DeVos, right? And she understands you, which she doesn't. And we're going to create an educational system that will get you off drugs, find you a nice wife or husband with whom you will stay forever, and educate your children, and with any luck, take them to church. It's not going to happen. So I don't know what to do about it. I really don't. I just don't think that's soluble. I think the only thing you can do is arrange income transfers that make life as tolerable as possible for those people.
Reinforce the dependency.
Yes, right. Well, if you tell me a better thing to do, I mean, the other thing you could do is resort to starvation. I mean, you can say you get nothing or go to work. Now, I tried that with a son, and it worked out pretty well. I don't think you can do it on a large scale. I just don't know. I really don't know. As for the institutions being powerful, well, I'm all for that. I'm all for countervailing power wherever we can build it into this system. Now, I don't know about trade unions. That's another thing I have to think about some more, because that is also a countervailing institution. One other thing. What Trump is proposing to do on infrastructure, where you say, and you're quite right, that there are not immediate projects that can be undertaken, is to make block grants to the states for projects on which the permitting process will take less than 90 days. Now, are there such projects? I'm sure the states would conjure them up pretty quick. But at least it shows some sense that the problem with the Obama thing was, as he laughingly said, there weren't any shovel-ready projects. As for the Fed, I can depress you even more because there are lots of vacancies on the Fed. Trump is going to be filling a lot of vacancies on the Fed. It's going to be interesting. I mean, if you think that this fight over the Supreme Court is going to be tough because they can win that easily, it's going to be interesting to see what he does. I mean, if he's a real inflationist, he is going to appoint people who are undisturbed by 3 or 4% annual inflation. So I think that institution is right now up for grabs. So I can't fix your family problem. I can't fix your opioid problem. I'm warning you, you've got a Fed problem. And what else have you got? Well, that's about it. That's
Church, going to church.
Yeah, well, look, can I spend 1 minute on this?
Yeah.
I recently moved part-time to Phoenix, Arizona. Phoenix, Arizona there are more churches in Phoenix, Arizona than in any place I have ever been. You've been there. I mean, you drive down Camelback and it's one church after another. Now, I was brought up in a house where those people were supposed to hate me, so I bought a house and got fences and all sorts of stuff. The thing I found was that the level of civility in society is staggeringly high. People say good morning, little children have good manners. They address you by your last name until given permission to do otherwise. The first day I was there, I came out of Starbucks and some woman was coming toward me and she said, "Good morning." And I said, "Excuse me, ma'am, could I ask you a question? I'm new here. Why did you say good morning? I don't know you." And she said, "It's the nice thing to do." This is true. This is what happened. So when I threw in church, it was at least the only bright thing I see on the horizon that might cope with some of that problem. And to me, that was a big surprise. I can give you incident after incident of that, which coming from Washington, D.C., where civility at all income levels of society is non-existent, either to each other or to others, it came as a shock to me. So that's why I threw it in. Also, it gets people a little aroused sometimes in some audiences. So.
Rory.
Thanks for your talk. You said attention must be paid to this group that you think is hopeless. Can't get inside these people's heads, and probably maybe I would want to, but one reading I have of the administration, of Bannon, of the advisors, is they know all that. They probably know everything you said about the wall, and that they did what they needed to do to get elected. But what they're doing here is partly playing for time. The coalition in 2020 to get him reelected will not get as many of these Rust Belt state, Michigan, Wisconsin voters, because they're not going to get these jobs back. But they might get other voters who see that he's not Hitler and that he's not, and that the economy's growing at 3. So that's one. What really strikes me though is that there doesn't seem to be an economic engine. There seems to be short and medium-term fixes in terms of infrastructure spending and sort of some trade protectionism, but there's no clear way that to turn the general economy's competitiveness around versus, I guess, China on technology. I mean, that seems to be the big missing piece. And I saw David Goldman, the economist, who's a bit of a free thinker, but his big argument was defense spending, grants for R&D, long-range defense spending is the sine qua non. It's the fundamental thing America has to do because they can't compete against the real protectionism is defense. And in this case, the science and R&D funding from the government there's a multiplier effect. I haven't heard anybody talk about this except Goldman, but it's interesting that the defense spending thing that Trump's sort of promising because he wants to make the military great again too, sure, why not, but it doesn't seem to be in the budget. It's very rarely linked with any economic growth platform. And I was wondering if you've heard about.
Well, you made a couple of points. Number one, the question of where, first of all, the increase he's targeted for the military is 3% compared to what was in the last Obama budget. It's trivial. The idea of the military as an engine for R&D, I mean, that's how it works in Israel, right? I mean, almost all these entrepreneurs who start all these companies come out of the military.
Not the military as an engine, R&D research, which is first of all.
I'm saying it could be the other way around. It depends how you spend the military budget, right? But he's cut basic research in many areas. Now, that's what he says. We'll see what happens when the budget becomes a budget. But the engine of economic growth is the capitalist system. If incomes are rising, and not a lot, things take care of themselves. I mean, get out of here, go to the Midwest, go somewhere where people start businesses, where entrepreneurs start businesses. That's where growth comes from. It doesn't come out of Washington, and it doesn't come out of fiscal policy. Now, yes, it's good if we have a general framework of competition and rule-based businesses and so on, but basically, we can't see where the growth is. We never could. I mean, did you think, well, you're young enough, so you probably thought when you were 6 years old that you'd have a cell phone, but the older people didn't. Things happen. That's how an economy grows. They don't grow from somebody making a 5-year plan for how much to spend on R&D. It just doesn't work that way. Now, I will say this. China has taken central planning to a level that nobody anticipated central planning could do. Of course, the collapse of the Soviet Union showed that, they had a large supply of left-footed shoes, but they didn't have any right-footed shoes. Planning, my favorite enterprise is strip malls. Okay, I know people don't like strip malls, but if you look at a strip mall, just think of all those little businesses that have started in the strip mall. There's somebody doing nails, and somebody else is doing braiding, and somebody else has decided to have yoga mats. I don't know what they are. That's where the American economy grows. I mean, think of this. We have an obesity problem in America, apparently, right? Go into a department store and look at the sizes now available and things. There's all you want. Now they're called extra large, they're not called obese. Of course, that might deter sales. But the economy, in New York City, if it were raining like it was here this morning, there'd be 85 Africans on Fifth Avenue selling umbrellas. That's what the American economy is all about. It's not about infrastructure planning. It's not about all this stuff. And that's why what I didn't talk about was repealing all these regulations that make it very difficult to start businesses. I didn't do that because that's really my specialty, and I can talk about to eye-watering length and detail. I didn't want to do that. But one of the problems when we talk about policy is that a lot of it, as this gentleman pointed out, is irrelevant. You can make general policy, but you can't affect a lot of the things. And what you can affect is to keep an open economy, to try to have a tax code that penalizes consumption but not work and risk-taking, which is what a border adjustment tax would do. And conservatives have always been for. Try to keep government from draining too much. I mean, in France, now, government spending accounts for more than 50% of GDP, and they can't figure out why they're not growing. I can tell them why they're not growing. When you think about where is it, it's like somebody says, where's the next technical breakthrough going to come from? Well, if you knew, it wouldn't be a technical breakthrough, right? I mean, you think about it.
MIT. I know.
Yeah, well, maybe. And keep it open. Prevent regulations from stifling the disruptors. the Ubers, the business-to-business lenders, the things that really oil the creaky joints of an economy, rather than, and that's the funny part of this. I mean, if he gets his way with regulations, he will have contributed to the destruction of the things he's trying to preserve, because those are, if you dig holes in the ground and you pour concrete, he understands it. If you develop a chip that does whatever chips do better, he doesn't understand it. And it's the disruptors who are going to carry the American economy forward. So, a lot of what I just told you is irrelevant. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I had a question on labor market mismatch. So, a lot of employers, particularly around here, right, we can't get enough highly trained, I'm in engineering and physics and things. But like agricultural workers also come on these visas, and you hear that they're having trouble matching those, immigrant workers to crops, and so things are dying on the ground. On the other hand, we have the lowest labor force participation among able-bodied males in decades, right? So like, why is it, they say, well, Americans won't take those jobs. Well, I mean, if there's generous social welfare and you know that there's immigrant labor that they're not going to take them at a certain rate, but I mean, why can't they just, I've taken like 2 semesters of economics, right? Why can't they just raise wages?
Well, you could take a third, maybe he's figured it out. But, let me suggest this. First of all, a lot of that is by employers who don't want to raise wages.
Yeah, so, I mean.
A guy who doesn't take a job at $7 an hour might really find it decent at $15 an hour.
Yeah.
That's why I always worry about conservatives who automatically oppose increasing the minimum wage. It may be a cheap way of solving some of the problems. Now, when I said that at the AEI, it was met with no applause at all. But take agriculture, where they say
It's got to be cheaper than letting your crops rot on the vine, right?
Well, wait. One guy made an experiment. He posted these jobs at $20 an hour, which you've got to say is not $7. It's, he got no response, none. So I don't know if there is a disjunction partly created by our welfare benefits, which say
the welfare benefits for
right.
able-bodied people.
Yeah, I know. Right. You can axe the welfare benefits, but you can't axe the welfare benefits because no one's going to vote to axe the welfare benefits. So, okay, we don't like the cards we were dealt with, but those are the cards we have to play with. Now, you can do things. You can do things like making, for instance, one of the things in the so-called healthcare reform was that people with disability who were employable in other jobs could take them, or could be asked to take them, or made to take them. I'm not sure. You could make the continuation of various benefits contingent upon. But then when you think of how it works, look, I went to see how it works. Okay, you have to, when you have unemployment insurance, right, you have to show proof that you went looking for a job, or else you can't get unemployed. Okay, so I went to one of the meetings of the unemployed being addressed by I guess you'd call it a social worker, who said you have to have 3 tries for a job in order to come back next month and get your money. So what you do is, please go out in the first 3 stores you pass, ask for a job, and write down the name of the store. Now, there's almost nothing we can do about that. I think there is a problem. Now, as far as the training goes, we could make college free. Anybody for that? That would cost the taxpayer some money. Maybe that's a good investment.
It's free now.
Honey?
It's free. A junior college tuition is very low, and the Pell Grants are $5,000 a year. So if you come from a low-income family, you get more money in a Pell Grant than the cost of tuition. If you stay at home, you're going to make money.
Right. So we haven't solved that problem, right? By making college free. So, okay, I withdraw my suggestion. I'll try to find another one. But again, what I'm saying is the system, the capitalist system, overcomes a lot of this. It is costly and inefficient at times, and when a welfare state is grafted on it, it becomes somewhat more, but it's more humane. I mean, there are people who can't find work. if you're a 55-year-old coal miner, I don't care what you say, that person is maybe one or two, but is not going to find work for the rest of his life. So the question is, what do we do about it? We don't, Trump is going to bring back the jobs. He's not going to bring back the jobs.
This is not my question though, right? We're talking about agricultural work, able-bodied males who have the lowest labor force participation. That's all. If you say that.
Yeah, you want them to go and pick stuff, and they're not going to do it.
Yeah, if you say
Okay,
that they're not
so-
gonna do it, then they're not gonna do it, but.
Well, I mean, you could say, we're going to take away all your benefits unless you go pick strawberries, right? And no one's prepared to do that, I don't think.
Yeah, I can't just.
Your call.
I'd like to go back to education. Just a small part of your talk, you've covered so much ground. This gentleman, Wright, was talking about, in a way, the degradation of the corporation. This gentleman, that's talking about education. I'd like to combine them a little bit with the correction to begin with. Vocational education died because it was more expensive. A class of 30 people learning auto mechanics was far more expensive than 30 people taking Latin. It was not merely snobbery, it was lowering taxes, and you spend less on education with classical training than you do with
Good point.
vocational education.
Good point.
I think you should look into that.
It's a good point.
Secondly, let me go back to Mitt Romney's father. He came poor from Mexico, and he became something, an automotive engineer to begin with, because GM taught him to be an automotive engineer. Their college in Flint, their technical training in Flint, ultimately became the base of the University of Michigan at Flint. Now, many corporations in the past, good old days, educated their workforce and continually educated their workforce. And that, of course, that's an expense, so it is taxpayer supported in a way. The people who do the corporate rating, amongst things they cut back on is R&D and education within the corporation, such that the corporation today may educate by saying you do it on your own time. George Romney did it on company time. You do it on your own time, we'll give you a grant, you'll go online for a course or take it locally. Some companies are doing that. But basically what they're doing is, by example, let's go to South Carolina. I'm going to get an automotive company if I pay $150,000 per job or more to the company. That's a subsidy. And I'll provide them with workers by having taxpayers have a junior college or better in Spartanburg, and then you'll pick up these people as a result of further taxpayer expenditure. So we're going to teach them how to do the job you want, and we're going to pay you to hire them per job. Alabama's the same, etc. Now that is a warpage, I would say, of what we would want and did in the past, of having the corporation educate its own. And all that would be deductible ultimately on the bottom line. But they don't want to undertake that responsibility. And I think one of the things to talk about is responsibility and the economic advantage, which includes building in worker loyalty by having, and thus less turnover, by having the corporation take more responsibility for its education, for the education of the workers it wants.
Well, that's an interesting point. In the auto industry, here's what happened. When Governor Romney was educated, the big three auto companies had an oligopoly. they had what we would now call excess profits, and they used some of it for the purpose you described. One of the great forces for education was AT&T, which had a monopoly, had 1 million employees. We decided we'd rather have competition. We broke it up. And now, you sound like my friend Irving Crystal. I mean, that these institutions, but now because they are more profit driven and because there are fewer pockets of monopoly power and monopoly profits in the economy, those functions went. That was something corporations couldn't do anymore if they were to compete. If we're willing to grant, I mean, monopolies, the Pullman Company provided housing and education and everything else for its employees in Washington. It may have been substandard housing and so on, but they had social responsibility that they could afford until competition came along. I think what you describe is reemerging. I had a meeting with some people in the construction business who are now trying to set up vocational training. The Germans seem to have solved it with apprenticeship programs. And as I understand it, one of the meetings that these entourages who follow people around, Merkel's entourage and our people, whoever they are, if there are any appointed yet, had long discussions about introducing apprenticeship programs here. The problem is, in a highly competitive environment where corporations don't have the benefit of high profit margins. Now, Starbucks has very high profit margins. I mean, extraordinarily high profit margins. And they are funding the education of their staffs. But, and as long as that brand keeps producing those kind of profits, they'll do it. And they say they get the benefit of a loyal work staff that, say, McDonald's doesn't get. So it may be that we'll get some correction of that, but you're quite right. But the benefit we got for giving up that was a competitive auto industry, which is technologically advanced and producing far cheaper cars than they would otherwise be able to produce. Which do I favor? You know, I think if there are social functions, I would rather have the government performing the social functions or funding the social functions out of taxes than trying to rely on the goodwill of a CEO who's got to file his quarterly earnings report.
Just one quick, the
Sure.
airlines are competitive. They promote their pilots to more advanced planes by having training within the industry.
Yeah, but that's also due to the union.
Well,
And so the unions,
unions may be helpful sometimes.
yes, I'm not, look, you don't have to tell me that. I mean, they had been a force for good. I mean, if you take unions now of unskilled workers in Nevada, the hotel workers and so on, if they're the only instrument that can train these people to move up the ladder. So I don't know where I come out on trade unions. I know where I come out on some of the things they do. That's another matter. But what you're looking for is institutions that are free of extraordinary market pressures so that they can, I'll use the word indulge, or finance, or do these extracurricular activities.
Don't destroy the corporation financially and bring in an additional pressure which will then say, I can't afford it.
I'm not in favor of destroying any corporation that competition leaves around.
That's what this gentleman was raising. Am I right?
Private equity, corporate raiders.
Right. We got
no.
another question. Martha.
Sure. Well, this is a delightful presentation.
Well, that's very kind of you. I'm not uniformly received that way.
And as it happened, my uncle worked at AT&T, got out of World War II as a very young man, was a lineman
Right.
initially, a lineman in Minneapolis, Minnesota, eventually became a regional vice president in Omaha, and ultimately became one of the national vice presidents in New Jersey. So you see that. But that isn't my question. My question is really simple. Yeah, that was just an addendum. It's really simple. You used the word rent-seeking here and in your article. Could you tell me in 20 words or less, what is rent-seeking? Is it good or bad, and why?
Question
Well,
for
the
your
real answer to your question is no. I can't tell it to you in that, but I'll give you a thumbnail notion. It's earning more than you would in a competitive situation, either through a cartel or through, well, let's just leave it at that.
How about investing in the stock market? Is that risk?
No, that's risk-taking.
Okay, well, I don't know, but I won't, we needn't spend any more time.
I will send you, if you give me your address, I will send you a one-page, no, you shouldn't leave here more ignorant than you came in. That is very big. So if you give me your address, I will send you a workable definition of
Well,
rent
that would be
seeking.
very kind of you.
Okay, I'd be glad to do that.
Harvey.
I want to get back to something you said a while ago about Walmart, and if you ask the man, does he prefer a less expensive product to a paycheck, he would say prefers the paycheck. I would say the counter argument to that is how he votes his wallet. Walmart is very successful, sells an awful lot of products. I don't think he'd use it that way. You mentioned a woman making sneakers in some state or other. She's susceptible to being driven out of business by a technological advance. I guess the classic case is
Right.
the automobile doesn't have to come from abroad. It
Right.
can come from another state. But if Walmart sells a sweater that it got from China for $20 and the American-made one sells for $50, this worker, and then you don't have to be a wealthy man to buy a $20 sweater, this worker is going to benefit from having that $20 sweater.
Absolutely.
He now has $30 additional to spend or save, and the economy will be the beneficiary of that. All that said is the basic argument for free trade. Now, you mentioned with China that they do things that are upsetting, or certainly immoral. I don't know where the legality comes in. A $40,000 tariff on a $50,000 car. So the basic question, after clearly stating that I believe in free trade, is as a matter of policy, what would you advise the Trump administration, assuming we have a more amenable Trump or another president, if he turned to you and said, what should we do with China to try to redress these improprieties, inequities, grievances? What would you say?
Oh, I would say tit for tat. In
You
other
put
words,
tariff
we
on
will
all.
treat your goods like you treat ours.
So
Now,
is that not
that's
a trade war?
Well, there's a trade war now. We're just not fighting it.
So it would escalate the trade war as well.
Unless they change their policies. Now, let's tick down the policies. There would be no cost to saying that to them, if you steal our intellectual property, if you insist that companies turn over our intellectual property to you, we're not going to let those companies do business in China. Okay? Now, that means our companies might be deprived of the chance to, they all think they can beat the system, everyone I've talked to. Well, Westinghouse, which just went bankrupt, said, and they turned over their nuclear technology. So I would, I don't know, this is a bad phrase, but I would get tough with them. I wouldn't fool around with currency manipulation. It's too complicated, and they're manipulating their currency in the exact opposite direction at the moment to stop capital flows. But I would say you cannot go on doing this, or we will retaliate. The WTO has retaliatory mechanisms in it. You don't have to violate any WTO rules. You just have to go through the WTO procedures to set retaliation. Because it seems to me, if you're for free trade, you're for free trade in the search of long-run efficiencies of the world, distribution of world resources. I mean, that's what free trade is all about. What China is doing has nothing to do with that objective. It has nothing to do with that objective. They are producing steel and selling it on world markets at way below the cost of production, including financing costs, which come from Chinese banks, which are full of crappy paper, which will never be paid. Now, does that, my feeling, in the long run, they're going to have a problem with that. I mean, they cannot maintain those state-owned enterprises forever without causing huge problems internally. But I said that before, and the means of repression are apparently more effective than I thought.
Aren't we the beneficiaries of cheap steel now? Steel gets.
We used to say we're the if they want to do that, we get the cheap steel.
Right.
That's true, unless you're a steel worker.
Well, but that gets you back to the distributional
Right.
effect, which can happen, that comes from the advance of technology. But a lot of them, the horse and buggy industry, I don't know.
But this didn't come from the advance of technology. This came from subsidized steel production.
Well, what's
How are they getting the solar? They've taken away a lot of solar industry, solar business from everybody. They are subsidizing the solar, and no one can produce solar to compete with what they are subsidizing, with the financing they are subsidizing. It is not efficient in an economist sense to have products that don't cover their marginal cost displacing products that do.
But if solar energy costs us less, we now have more to spend on other things. I'm
Yes.
sure that some people will be unemployed, but there is no industry you can name that is but a small percentage of the economy. Everybody else is the beneficiary.
The beneficiaries are dispersed.
Yes.
There's no question that the beneficiaries are dispersed and that the pain is concentrated, right? I'm saying that as a long-run matter, if we don't do something to provide pain relievers to those who are pained, that system will collapse. And,
But that's the
you know, what
nature
would you
of
think?
the-
What would you think of a 1% tax on everything sold in Walmart to be distributed to everybody displaced by those imports?
I'm always suspicious of yet another government program.
Yes, so
for
am
some of
I.
the things that you suggest.
But I'm more suspicious of their programs than I am of ours.
One last follow-up. Are you concerned that if we adopt a policy like that, you put a tariff on our cars, we're gonna put a tariff on your steel and sweaters, et cetera, that we're going to revisit the smooth hauling 1931, which a lot of people say was really the motivation for the Depression?
Yeah, but it didn't, it wasn't. But let's assume it was for the purpose of your question, okay? I'm concerned about a lot of things, among them that. But I'm more concerned about what we hollowed out huge industries, allowing below-cost sales. Now, if China is going to have a much more efficient chip industry than we're going to have in 10 years, because they're subsidizing it to the tune of billions of dollars now and stealing our intellectual property to boot. Now, if you let that go on, we're going to be in a hell of a mess. And I don't see why we should do that. For instance, are you for a border adjustment tax?
I don't know. I've been hearing the arguments on it. I can take a page from your book and say I have to think about it.
Okay, well, think about it in this sense. Think about it in this sense. If you're an American trying to sell an Escalade in England, in Britain, they put a 20% tax on it. If they sell a Jaguar here, it comes in without tax. And they don't pay tax on it at all because they get their VAT back on an export.
If you convinced me, I'd say no, I'm against it. I prefer the cheaper Jaguar. I don't care that
Right.
if we,
So you don't care about the guy who would be making the car we're going to sell there. Okay, then look, that's a value judgment and you're entitled to it.
we have an unemployment rate here that's under 5%. Let's not make it that the bread lines are so long because
I'm not saying the bread lines are long. I'm not saying that Chicago is going to go into Lake Michigan. All I'm saying is that these are competing values,
Yes.
right? And since this isn't the kind of reception that Charles Murray gets otherwise, we are entitled to our competing values. And I have a greater affinity for what are they, the hoary-handed labor of something or other, than you do. I was brought up among those people. And so I'm more sympathetic to them than I am to the guy who wants a cheaper Jaguar. So this is social judgment. That's why we have voting.
That's a very nice point on which to end this fascinating variety that you. This is the program on constitutional government, and our guest today is Irwin Stelzer, an economist with a political interest. He's wincing
No, our racket was called political economy for a
Yeah,
long
political
time.
economy, but he studies economics, I would say from a political point of view, rather than politics from an economic point of view, like so many rather foolish political scientists. And he is a columnist for the Sunday Times and the Courier Mail in Australia, and he's a contributing editor at the Weekly Standard, where he has 2 articles in the latest issue, one very interesting on the oil question. He's been at the American Enterprise Institute and a senior director and a fellow at the Hudson Institute in Washington. He's a consultant on market strategy, pricing, and antitrust issues, and regulation in the United States and the United Kingdom. He got his PhD in economics from Cornell and has held teaching appointments at various universities. And he's going to talk to us today about Trump, President Trump.
Yes, so anyone who wants a bolt for the door, now is the time. Look, I approach this with a considerable amount of trepidation. First of all, I do not have the learning in political philosophy and all of that stuff. I'm just a tradesman who learned something about the economy. Second, any discussion of President Trump is likely to produce degrees of incivility, I think not seen since the Boston Patriots. I don't mean your team, I mean the ones who tarred and feathered people who they disagreed with. And third, I have to confess at the beginning that my New York City ear finds the Trump accent and shticks agreeable. So you can discount a lot of what I say because of that. And finally, I can't make up my mind about a lot of these issues. So as I understand it, this is a seminar, throwing out ideas. We'll see where we end up. But my most terrifying trepidation is that our host, Professor Mansfield, who does these multiple conversations with Bill Kristol, said we should be careful of trying to define Trump by his ideas. He's a demagogue, unpredictable, aiming to cause surprise, et cetera, to which I would add he's a liar, sometimes willfully so, sometimes because, as I think it was Lorenz Hart's lyrics, this put it as the self-deception that believes the lie. And I think that's true. But I'm going to throw fear to the caution to the winds, rather. And but don't confuse my description of this phenomenon with endorsement. If you want endorsement, you can ask me later, and I'll just tell you what I think. Trump never sat down with a reading list and decided to cull the great philosophers and political scientists for ideas that would interfere with his evenings watching Fox News. So instead, but don't discount the influence of Steve Bannon, of whom you've heard, who does have a full-blown, coherent worldview and philosophy that he grafted onto Donald Trump's instincts, prejudices, hunches as to what appeals to voters. So I want to preface the following with this thought. When Trump says he will put America first, he has not studied the pre-World War II history of America, and did not know that the America First Committee, which was founded at Yale Law School by, among others, Jerry Ford and Potter Stewart, and with the appalling Charles Lindbergh as a spokesman. When he labeled the media enemies of the people, that was not based on his study of the French Revolution or his reading of Ibsen or his reading of Nikita Khrushchev, who said that phrase should never be used because it eliminates the possibility of any kind of ideological fight and calls for the physical annihilation of anyone who agrees with you. But Bannon is there. I mean, he knows what those phrases mean. He knows what the history means, and Trump finds them agreeable and consistent. So I think Bannon spent a lifetime seeking an effective vessel to whom to transfer his ideas, this coherent philosophy, and I've chosen to call Trumpism, which I know may not please you, but I'll take a chance, okay? Now, the first step in this is to put America first. And to put America first, you have to end voters' dependence on traditional media. To do that, because the traditional media tend to niggle around the edges, but if rising deficits, and here's where I think we have to think about it, because Bannon is very smart, and if rising deficits were to trigger inflation, remember we have a pretty fully employed economy at the moment, given constraints of labor supply, and therefore an infrastructure program might end up being quite inflationary. Because there isn't any excess capacity in the economy, or not enough to accommodate a $1 trillion infrastructure program. So if you think about it, now I'm trying to remember when I was radical, which was, Lincoln was not president at the time. But if you think about what inflation is designed to do and what Bannon really knows, is it would wipe out the rentier class. I mean, that's what it's designed to do, and the crucifixion of debtors on the cross of a relatively stable economy. Trump is a traditional debtor. We don't know how much relative to his assets, but he is going, like all real estate developers, and he can testify to this, they go and hock big time. And inflation is a wonderful thing if you have a lot of debts. It wipes them out for you. And I think you have a confluence of Bannon's understanding of that. And remember, during the campaign, Trump tried out the idea of reducing the national debt by declaring bankruptcy. In other words, he finds the debt overhang rather burdensome, wouldn't like to pay it back if he didn't have to. So I think there is kind of a radical position. But if you go back to what conservatives say, which is, no, the way out of this is faster growth, that's based on the notion, as President Kennedy said, that a rising tide lifts all boats. But we now know that's not true. It wasn't true before the Great Recession, and it has not been true since. The rising tide of economic growth has lifted a lot of yachts, but it's lifted a lot of rowboats moored at, well, I don't know what you do with rowboats. I've never been in one, but whatever. They didn't have a lot of those on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. The result has been a revolt of the blue-collar masses. They've not shared in the boom. They didn't share in the boom before the Great Recession. They were hurt badly by the Great Recession, and they are now part of what Trump likes to call his movement. I think this is a serious problem, this problem of inequality in America. If any of you want to read Piketty's book, I know a lot of people who own it, and you might keep a note in your head as to which of these appeal to you and which don't. First, there are three parts of America first: infrastructure, protectionism, and foreign policy. The infrastructure part, the underlying basis for these are two. First is emotional. This is rather simple. You got a builder as president. He has an emotional reaction. He would like our airports to be better than those in Asia, our trains faster than those in Japan and France, our roads smoother than those in Germany. This isn't a matter of cost-benefits analysis. This is a matter of national pride. This is how you want your country to look. Now, it is true that over the years, dictators also try to build glitzy infrastructure projects, sports stadiums and stuff. And I'm sure that immediately leaps to mind as I said this to many people. But the first part of this infrastructure thing has got nothing to do with money or cost-benefits analysis. It has to do with pride. The second part is that if you want to make America great again, you need pretty rapid economic growth, 3%, 4%, sometimes 5%, he says, sometimes 6%. It depends on the target, on the mood of the moment. But certainly 1% won't do it and 2% won't do it. 3%, it's okay, 4% better, 5 or 6% would be wonderful, and if he can figure out how to do that, I hope he will tell us. The more rapid economic growth would solve many of the problems, no question about that. It would generate tax revenues, you wouldn't have to make as many hard choices as we now have to make, and there would be plenty of cash to fund the Democrats' wildest dreams and Republicans' military buildups or whatever they have in mind. So far, that's pretty traditionally conservative. Get more economic growth, you get more cash, and so on. But I think unlike the economic conservatives, let's call them the traditional wing of the Republican Party, Trump isn't concerned, I believe is not concerned about deficits. Now, he says he is, and the promises he made about deficits, but the fact is he would take infrastructure and rising deficits over no infrastructure and a more closely balanced budget any day of the week. And he's not talking about a piddly little $800 billion infrastructure program that satisfied President Obama. He's talking about $1 trillion. Now, where did he get the $1 trillion from? It's bigger than 800 billion. I mean, anybody could understand that. But still, the fact is that basically they are part of the establishment, part of the status quo. And so that's where Bannon came up with this idea of enemies of the people. Now, every sort of dictator, authoritarian, needs an enemy list. In Latin America, it's American capitalists. In Europe, for a long time, it was Jews, or if you wanted to be polite about it, you called it Israel. To Trump, the campaigner, it was Wall Street, the place to which he eventually went to hire most of his people. So I think they selected the media as the enemy of the people for 3 reasons. First, anyone who watched campaigns would know the rapturous response that Sarah Palin got and subsequent very conservative politicians get when they attack the media, the mainstream media. You remember Trump's attacks on Megyn Kelly, on Charles Krauthammer. They resonated with his base. Second, it's important to delegitimize sources of information other than yourself, so that what you have is, you remember the old Chico Marx, who do you believe, what I tell you or your own eyes. If you delegitimize other sources, then tweets become a great source of information, and you've gone around and over the traditional media. And third, it sets the stage for curtailing the privileges accorded to traditional media. So you now have talk show hosts calling in on Skype to ask questions of the press secretary. And you have traditional media worry that they're not going to get their usual seats at presidential press conferences and so on, or get called upon. All of that is necessary if to neuter the traditional media, so that you can essentially clear the way for what the president calls America First. Now, let me tell you the 3 policies that are necessary. What I want you to think about as I talk is which of the policies you find objectionable. I know I learned last night some of the intense antipathy, let's call it, I would call it style if it was any, to the Trump vulgarity, shall we say. It certainly does not appeal to a more effete, elitist audience. I think that's putting it at a minimum. But I'm trying to talk about policy.